and welcome to the Presumption Podcast. I'm your host, co-host, Sara Azari, and hi, Jim Griffin.
Hey, Sara.
And Matt, our producer, our wonderful producer. And today we're joined by a very special guest, Justin Brooks. Justin, welcome to the podcast. Justin is a lot of things. He's a professor of practice at University of San Diego School of Law, where he teaches criminal procedure and directs an LLM program in comparative law in Spanish. He also administers a national moot court program in Mexico and coordinates the work of 35 innocence organizations in Latin America. We'll definitely want to tap into that in this conversation. He was the founding director of the California Innocence Project for 24 years until earlier this year. And under his direction, the project freed 40 innocent people from prison, including someone we'll be talking about also is NFL player Brian Banks. He's been recognized several times by the Los Angeles Daily Journal as one of the top 100 lawyers in California. And in 2010 and 2012, California Lawyer Magazine honored him with the Lawyer of the Year award. He was named International Lawyer of the Year by the California Bar International section in 2020. And in the same year was named Champion of Justice by one of my favorite organizations. I'm a life member and was on the board, National Association of Criminal Defense Attorneys. He's the author of the only legal case book devoted to the topic of wrongful convictions and the author of You Might Go to Prison Even Though You're Innocent, a book that details the causes of wrongful convictions based on his experience of more than 3 decades as a criminal defense attorney and innocence organization director. I mean, how old are you? 3 decades. He's portrayed by Academy Award nominated actor Greg Kinnear in the feature film Brian Banks. So welcome. Justin. First thing I was going to start off with is your book. You Might Go to Prison Even Though You're Innocent. And, Jim and I know that very well. I think it came up recently with his case, Alec Murdaugh, who I think was wrongfully convicted on murder charges. It's, a very fascinating book that takes a deep dive into sort of the flaws and prejudices of the legal justice system. The criminal justice system. And you cite to some real life instances, cases that you were involved in where the person was innocent and was sent to prison. Share with us why you might go to prison even though you're innocent.
Sure. Thank you for starting with my book. Usually when you do podcasts and stuff, it's the last thing people talk about.
Not here.
Starting up with it. Available now on Amazon. But so I was asked by a publisher to sit down and think about the last 30 years doing innocence cases and kind of think about categorizing them. And it was a really interesting task to get into because when I started in this work, as you guys know, people were deeply cynical whether there was anyone innocent in prison. And that used to be the old argument. We talk about Reuben Hurricane Carter and a few cases, but, the pre-DNA world, there weren't these definitive cases. And now, after decades of DNA, and we've documented 3,300 cases of wrongful conviction in the United States, we now can kind of reflect on the why. Why did these people go to prison? What are the different categories? And some of the things I thought about were more obvious than other things. Like we've been talking about bad identification procedures for years, and we've done a lot of reforms in that. We've talked about false confessions. We now know that 17% of wrongful convictions involve people actually confessing. But then there were other topics in the book that I got into when I started thinking about my own cases. For example, people who live with people they're in relationship with increase their chances of being wrongfully convicted because often a person comes home and they find a dead body. They will always be a suspect,
right?
Because more than 50% of homicides in the U.S. are domestic.
Mm-hmm.
So people don't realize often that they're suspects, but if it's their partner that ends up dead, they will be a suspect. And I had 2 cases like that we ultimately led to exonerations. And they were basically just convicted because witnesses come forward to say there's problems in the relationship, which of course there are in more than 50% of relationships. And that's about as many end in divorce in Southern California. And then the police can put them on the scene. So they have opportunity, they have motive, and now they're on their way to a wrongful conviction unless there's another suspect involved. And I think that's something people don't really think about. Another topic I get into, which, I moved to California 25 years ago, and it took me a while to figure out that the further you get from the water, the weirder it gets. But practicing in those desert counties, I find that, there's this sort of opposite of over policing. So I look at the dynamic of there's over policing that happens in urban areas that often leads to wrongful convictions, like rounding up all the kids on a street corner because they're all assumed to be dealing drugs if a couple of them are dealing drugs, and they can all be charged with possession and distribution. And you see those wrongful convictions, which I saw early on in my practice in Washington, D.C. But in the rural areas, clients like my client Bill Richards, who came home and found his wife beaten to death in the middle of nowhere, they just don't know how to process a homicide scene. So they contaminate all the evidence. They don't do time of death analysis. And by the time competent people take a look at it, it's too late. All the evidence has been destroyed. And also in those small towns, they are much more resistant to lawyers coming in and reopening cases and looking over their work. So throughout the book, I look at these different causes. Actually, the first title of the book was Top 10 Reasons You Might Go to Prison Even Though You're Innocent. But my publisher thought that was too clickbaity.
Yeah.
It's a great book title, I got to say. I love it.
So it's largely because of false confessions, shoddy investigations, right?
Yeah, those are different chapters. So chapter 1, the first chapter is the chapter that started my work in innocence work. And it was that 30 years ago, I read about a woman on death row in Chicago who was sentenced to death on a plea bargain. And I thought, how in hell did she get the death penalty on a plea bargain? A 23-year-old. And I met with her on death row. She was scheduled to be executed, and she told me she was innocent and that she didn't understand what her lawyer had done. She didn't really go to court. She'd hardly talk to her lawyer, and her lawyer pled her straight up to double homicide and got the death penalty. And I started investigating that case with my students, and we ultimately were able to prove her innocence. And the case was so shocking to me that I literally quit my faculty position in Michigan and came out to California to start this project. And it was just, so the first chapter in the book is you hired the wrong lawyer. And she did what I've seen a lot of people do, is that she had a very high profile case. So a very competent public defender, this woman who'd handled hundreds of felony trials, was assigned to her. And she fires this competent lawyer, and her friends just hire a lawyer in the neighborhood, give him a $10,000 retainer, and he doesn't even do this kind of work. And he just goes and pleads her straight up and gets the death penalty. And so I start the book with trying to educate people to understand the way lawyer appointments work, what public defenders are, the difference between public defenders and private attorneys, the difference between contracts. I mean, California, for example, has it all. We've got great public defenders' offices. We've got great private lawyers, but we've also got terrible private lawyers.
We also have panel lawyers and alternate public defenders. We have a lot of options in case of conflicts. But Justin, to your point, I think there's this myth that public defenders, and Jim and I have talked about this with other guests too, there's this myth that somehow, getting a private lawyer, any private lawyer, is better than a public defender. There's even a joke, people refer to public defenders as public pretenders. And it's like, no, there's some really great public defenders. And if you don't have the resources to get a really great private lawyer, then that is what you should do. You should stick with a public defender. My last question before I turn it over to Jim is, this is something you also address in your book. We know that a conviction is life-changing, obviously, for anyone, irrespective of what the sentence is. But you specifically talk about this in your book, about that impact on somebody who's wrongfully convicted. What have you learned in your decades of work with the Innocence Project about how a conviction impacts somebody who's wrongfully convicted?
Oh, the circle of devastation is so wide, and people really don't see it because, in innocence work, first of all, people only really see our successes, right? The media is not interested in the failures, and they're not even really interested in the cases that much until you win them. Getting their attention on a case, no matter how good you think it is there's very few cases that capture the imagination of the media and the general public, unless you got a great venue like Netflix, or your podcast can do that, where people can really hear the whole story. So they don't see the failures, they don't see how devastating that is for everybody. And even when you win these cases, and even when you walk people out and they see that footage of the hand in the air and everybody's happy, they don't see the devastation that's happened in those families all those years those people were incarcerated, how much financial impact it's all had. Most people lose everything by the time their trial is even over. They're out of resources. Mm-hmm. And now often the primary financial person in the family's gone off to prison, how it impacts their children, how it impacts the parents and brothers and sisters and friends. And with my clients, I often say to them, right before they're walking out of prison, I say, for the next 24 hours, 48 hours, everybody's going to care about you. And then they're going to slowly disappear. And you're going to have to put your life back together. And, we're going to take this step by step, but it is going to be hard. And you only see that ecstatic moment, but eventually it sinks into them how much they've lost and how many challenges they have. And technology is incredibly difficult for them. I had a client, Mike Hanline, who did 36 years in prison and was an auto mechanic when he went to prison. And he looked at his first car when he got out and was so frustrated because he said, this is a computer. This is
yeah.
And now he works on antique motorcycles because he doesn't understand modern technology at all. So it's a huge struggle. My client, Brian Banks, described it beautifully. He said, when you go to prison, it's like you've died and your family all mourns you and everybody's sad and it's awful. And then time goes on. And it's you start fading away in terms of your role in that family and how people are feeling about you. And then you come home and that space has completely disappeared. In your head, it's going to be the same as it was, but that space that you had is gone. Mm-hmm. And it's very, very sad what happens to them. And that's why we have a real responsibility to take care of people when they come out of prison.
Can I jump in with a simpleton's question? Which is to say, after a client is exonerated and they're trying to go back into society, is the idea now that their criminal record has been expunged, or do they still have to kind of go through the whole rigmarole with a new employer to explain their story and how they're out? Like, how does all that work?
Yeah, so it depends on the case. And, lawyers always have that same answer. It depends. But it does. Because in some cases, well, for instance, the worst ones are sex offender cases, because with sex offender cases, they're now on all kinds of private lists. And now you've got all these websites where they're listed. So Brian Banks, for example, he was a convicted sex offender. He literally carried around with him in plastic the cover of the LA Times showing he was exonerated, because when he was applying for apartments and jobs, they were pulling up that he was a convicted sex offender. And It's very difficult to clear all those records. We do have a process in California for a declaration of innocence.
Right.
That requires an entire separate court hearing and getting a judge to agree to it, and often having to get the district attorney's office to agree with it. And it's frustrating because if we believe you're innocent until proven guilty and you've had your conviction reversed, then you're innocent, right? You're legally innocent. And that, exactly. I always say to reporters when they say, well, they haven't been found innocent, I said, well, you haven't either. Your conviction's been reversed. This murder. Where were you on that night? Because they're as innocent as we are. But when you're declared innocent and when a prosecution dismisses, it means that's the only person who can't be prosecuted for that crime. So now you're way more innocent than we are. But so it depends on the kind of case of how easy or difficult that is. But it does take lawyers being involved and processes. And that's why we so desperately need people working in this area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to follow up on that thought, Justin, how many of the wrongfully convicted who've been exonerated through the Innocence Project or otherwise, I mean, have a realistic avenue of financial relief from whether it's a law enforcement who hid evidence or someone who falsely identified them? I mean, I think people in the general public think, oh, well, they get out there and get millions of dollars, but I don't think that's the situation, is it?
Yeah, no, it's not. And when I started the California Innocence Project, in California, the maximum you could get in compensation was $10,000, no matter how long you've been in prison.
Wow.
And you had to go through a whole legal process to get it, so no one ever even got it. So we wrote a law that we've now amended 5 times, basically because how much we've had to fight the Attorney General, including our current Vice President, on those cases because they litigated every one of them. And so we'd get the person out, we'd exonerate them, and then the next thing we had to do is go to Sacramento and have a whole separate hearing on whether they're innocent again against the Attorney General's office to get compensated. Our new law is very good. It now says, look, if a judge reverses your conviction, finds you're innocent, you automatically get $150 a day for every day you're wrongfully incarcerated. But there's only 38 states that have any form of compensation. Ours is one of the best because we've had people on the ground fighting for it for 2 decades.
I don't know. Go ahead.
In some states, all you get is like free community college or things like that, but not actually financial compensation. And then there's all the complication of a civil suit, which you're referring to. And almost very few cases can get through the immunity. Judges have total immunity, prosecutors have total immunity, police officers have qualified immunity, and it's only in those rare cases where they can get past that to get a civil suit. And that's why one of the saddest things is every year we at our Innocence Network conference, you'll look around the room and hundreds of people have been exonerated are there, and some of them are millionaires that are in $1,000 suits, and some of them are in total poverty. And it's very hard to explain to your client, like, how come that guy got money and he spent 20 years in prison as innocent and I didn't? And you start having to explain, qualified immunity.
Right.
It's not very
I don't know exactly how this friend of mine who was actually on this podcast does this, but Jenny Bongine, who reversed Cosby's conviction, she has a very interesting practice model where most of these cases are out of Chicago. She has a relationship there with all the inmates and stuff. So she gets these, essentially she picks up these wrongful convictions, assesses them in a way where she works on a contingency fee because these people don't have any money. And once she is able to overturn the conviction, she then goes with a civil lawsuit, and she's been extremely successful, gets like millions of dollars. So I don't know. I mean, she knows a lot about the corruption and within the police force there in Chicago and sort of what goes down. But I guess it depends on the jurisdiction. But one question I had for you, Justin, is that for us, DNA is often the death knell. But what we, I think, tend to forget is that it also helps free the wrong guy. What, in your experience, is the role of DNA in overturning convictions?
Well, it changed everything. I mean, it's the most significant advancement in criminal procedure of the last century. Prior to DNA, there was deep cynicism about whether there were innocent people in prison. Finally, we had the gold standard of forensics that could not only definitively prove someone innocent, but almost definitively prove the person who did it. And basically, I say almost because now we're at the statistics of, it's 1 in 20 billion that it's wrong. It's basically statistically, do you have an evil twin out there you don't know about committing crimes? Is basically the statistics come down to. So there's just nothing that comes remotely close to it. And once that door opened in the 90s, and we saw those first few hundred people exonerated, just going to old rape kits and testing them and showing definitively this is not the semen of my client in this rape kit, it changed everything. And what we're seeing now is what DNA did is it opened a door so that once judges started seeing DNA exonerations, for example, in identification cases, that started opening the idea of, wait a minute, these identifications aren't that good because DNA is showing time and time again that they actually got the wrong guy. And that's led to every reform that we've accomplished in the innocence world has stemmed from that. If we didn't have DNA, we wouldn't be anywhere on this stuff because it would still be judges just denying these habeases. I mean, the first habeas I filed in California in 2000 We spent like a year working on it. It was over 100 pages. It had another 100 pages of attachments. It was stamped denied within 45 minutes of filing it. Judges would just, denied all these habeas petitions that guys would write from prison. And now we would get, in the last 10 years, I would say the California Innocence Project, we would have judges responding and granting hearings in like 75 to 80% of the cases that we filed, because they started seeing that, like, wait a minute, these guys, first of all, screen these cases out very seriously. And we only filed in cases where we believe we have a strong claim. And it's really changed everything. I cannot overstate the impact of DNA on the criminal legal system. I'm very grateful to all the scientists working in the healthcare industry, which is where it's all coming from. None of it was developed for the criminal legal system, but it's really helped us.
So, Justin, you mentioned this twice now, false identifications. And I mean, is that principally the primary source of an innocent person being convicted? A victim falsely identifies through a photo lineup or through a actual lineup. Is that what you see mostly, or are there other common causes of false convictions?
Yeah, so in the first several hundred of DNA exonerations that we saw come down, in more than half of them, there had been a witness who had identified the suspect incorrectly. And that has led to an entire field of research and tons of PhDs that have made this their life work, of looking at identifications and ultimately coming to the conclusion that even though jurors put huge amounts of weight on these things, they are really not very good evidence unless the witness literally knows the suspect and knew them before the crime. And there's a number of reasons for this. I've got hours and hours of lectures on this, which we don't have time for today, but it just comes down to the frailty of human memory, the ability of your memories to be contaminated very easily, and poor police procedures being used to extrapolate those memories. And then that combined with the fact that officers often will say things like, well, we've picked up a guy and we've got a lineup, and now you're thinking, okay, they're in there. And now you pick whoever looks most like the person, and you might say, looks like number 3. And then the officer says, good job. And now by the time you go to court, you're saying, I'm 100% sure it's that person. Right. And you are never 100% sure because we're not documenting any of this stuff. And a trial lawyer doesn't really know half the time what even happened during those procedures, so they can't really cross on it. And then we have issues like cross-racial identifications, which are almost always wrong. And lawyers aren't doing a good job of explaining to jurors that, look, it's not about racism. It's about the way people's brains work and how they develop in the first 5 years of their life. And if you're not exposed to a lot of different races at a very young age, you actually don't have the mechanism to do cross-racial identifications. But because people are uncomfortable always talking about race, that jurors aren't educated to that. And it's crazy how bad they are. Like, they're absolutely terrible. So I devoted a chapter of my book to that topic, and that wasn't enough. It's the worst. And it's one of the thing that's frustrating is it's one of the ones that's easily, I don't want to say remedied, but we can make it so much better by just having good procedures. In the same way with false confessions, we know 17% of wrongful convictions have false confessions. If we just made mandatory recording of all interrogations, we could decrease that number profoundly. The jury could actually see the context of how it was obtained and put appropriate weight to it, instead of them just saying, oh, the guy confessed, so must be guilty. Right.
Now, you were talking about false identification and how unreliable it is. It just, the whole Koberger bushy eyebrow debate jump out at me as to, we're probably going to hear a lot more about false identifications in that case. Speaking of Koberger, the big scientific evidence in the case is that IGG, investigative genetic genealogy. Is that going to be helpful or hurtful in innocence world, you think?
It's funny. I was just teaching about this last week in my criminal procedure class, and I'm basically a civil libertarian, right? I mean, I'm a defense attorney. I've grown up, a progressive. But I tell you, when you walk just one person out of prison and knowing they would have died in prison if it wasn't for DNA data banks, it really kind of challenges your civil libertarian views on whether we all should be in a data bank,
Right.
because it can make that profound a difference in people's lives. So it's going to make a huge difference, because now it's kind of like DNA, and every step of it, we've seen it become more powerful. So in the first phase of DNA, you needed a quarter-size sample of biological material to even do a DNA test. And then we came along with, wait a minute, we can actually replicate this stuff, and you could use a microscopic sample. And then we came to this thing of mitochondrial DNA, where you can use hair without a root. And all of a sudden that opened up all new doors of DNA. And let's go back to the evidence and see what hair is on clothes that now can be tested. And now with this familial DNA stuff, and with everybody going out and actually sending their biological material to companies to test without knowing whether their second cousin was a murderer, it is opening up whole new avenues for investigation. And like always with DNA, it leads to convicting more people.
Right.
And it leads to the potential of exonerating some people.
I know Barry Scheck has been, we haven't talked to him yet, but I know that he has had some cases involving IGG, because we spoke to Cece Moore, and she had, I think, consulted with him. But I think the problem that Jim and I have with it, not that it's come up in our own cases, but in Kohberger, is that, the prosecution, there's no higher authority, there's no Supreme Court decision yet on this. And so these trial courts are repeatedly just calling it, immaterial. It's not coming in discovery. And here we have the prosecution calling it an informant. Literally, they're calling the IGG that led to the arrest of Kohberger an informant. And they don't want to produce the FBI material that really goes to the protocol, whether it was followed or not, whether they use the right databases. They're only allowed to use certain databases. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on. I think it's a problem. I think we're facing, besides just your cousin being in the system, we're dealing with a very critical piece of science that they're not even calling science.
Yeah, well, you touched on something that has bothered me forever, and that's the discovery aspects of this stuff. It's just obnoxious. Forever they had these DNA data banks, and they wouldn't allow defense access to them. It's like, this is again another prosecutor's tool, and then you've got to be at the mercy of the court to hopefully grant it. And you've got an innocent person, and you can't run this thing in a data bank because you have no access to it. And then the claim is that there's a privacy interest. And I'm saying, wait a minute. If they run the test and it comes out a match, how is this not Brady material that has to be disclosed? And if it comes back as nothing, it's not like the judge can't review it and then decide whether it's discoverable. So this is the same old battles again,
right, that you had before. Yeah. And by the way, they're splitting, they're arguing essentially that the SNP piece of it that goes to the lab, where there's a SNP extraction, that is science. But then they're divorcing it from the FBI family tree investigation, and they're saying that's just investigation. But the whole point is that this is one unit. This is, so it drives me crazy. Anyway,
we do want to talk to civil lawyers. Like when you start seeing what civil lawyers get with discovery and the idea, and the general public, by the way, because I talk about this a lot, they really do think that defense attorneys have advantages in the criminal court because the burden of proof is on the government. Look, I'm asleep in bed when they're at the crime scene. I've been appointed to the case when they've interviewed the witnesses. I don't know, you're late to the date always. Now you're at the mercy of turn stuff over, and then the rules don't have the same discovery rules as civil, where they got to turn everything over. It's just like, well, we'll decide if this is potentially exculpatory or not, and then we'll turn it over to you if we think it's helpful to you. And, and the crime labs are just cops and lab coats. I mean, those are part of the government.
Yeah.
So defense attorneys have always been an extreme disadvantage.
Yeah.
This is another example.
So about Brian Banks, because that was obviously a huge victory for you and Brian, and became a movie. I think there was an Oxygen piece on it. And now Brian is doing some great work. He's speaking. and empowering a lot of people. But so basically, I'm just going to lay out the basic facts, which is in 2002, he was 17 years old. He was in high school. He was a football star. He was, I think, looking to be drafted to USC with a very promising future. And then his life took this drastic turn because he was falsely accused of kidnapping and raping a female classmate who later admitted that she had falsified the accusation. What sort of tell us the story about his exoneration and what led to that much deserved freedom?
Yeah, so Brian is the only client we ever took at the California Innocence Project who was out of custody. I mean, sometimes we won't even take a case if someone's got fewer than 3 years left, because we know how long the process is, how difficult it is, and we have so many lifer cases, death cases that just seemed we couldn't put resources.
Wait, I'm sorry. I thought he did 5 years.
He did, but he was out and on parole.
Oh, God.
And what happened to him was this 15-year-old classmate, and he was 16 at the time, and he was on his way, superstar football player. I mean, he went to Long Beach Poly, which you may not know is the biggest sports high school in the United States. More MLB players, more NBA players, more NFL players than any high school in the United States. Cameron Diaz and Snoop Dogg also went there. So very famous high school, and Brian was the superstar at that school. He had Pete Carroll coming to his practices, guaranteed him a free ride at USC. Everybody says he's going to the NFL. He's getting a lot of attention. And for whatever reason, jealousy, or we don't exactly know, this 15-year-old classmate accuses him of rape. Nobody investigates the case. Brian sits in juvie for a year waiting for trial. And the day of trial, his lawyer says, look, you're a big black teenager. You're going to go in that courtroom. They're going to believe her and not you. It's an all-white jury. You're looking at 40 years to life. Or take a deal, and I think I might be able to get you probation. If I get you probation, I'll get you back to high school, get you back in your life. Brian's crying. He says, can I talk to my parents? She says, nope, you got to make a decision right now. So, of course, he makes the decision to take the deal. Of course, the judge doesn't give him probation, gives him 6 years in prison. And Brian goes off to prison, his whole life destroyed. He gets out of prison, can't get a job. He's a convicted sex offender. He's got to wear an ankle monitor. Football's done for him. And one day out of the blue, this girl Facebook friend requests him and says, can we let bygones be bygones? Sorry about the stuff I made up about you raping me in high school.
Wow.
So Brian actually then had a video of her admitting that, where she met with him and he recorded it. And then he came to us, and I just thought, this case is so heartbreaking. This guy's so clearly innocent. And, and I know you'll relate to this. It's like with so many of your clients, they didn't have great lives before they got into trouble. And they didn't necessarily have the potential that they were going on to these amazing things. And Brian had everything taken away from him and a whole life in front of him. And he was still a kid when I took his case on. He was still in his 20s. So we took the case.
Who was the lawyer? Who was his lawyer?
I don't really want to name his lawyer. His lawyer is now a judge.
What?
Who played him in the movie? Who's the actor who played him in the movie?
Oh, who played Brian or played the lawyer? The lawyer was a woman.
Oh, okay.
The lawyer was a woman. She had a very small part, so I don't even remember the actress who played
her.
But
listen, Justin, let me just say this. We're not bad-mouthing anyone. We stated facts. We're saying she advised him to take a plea, and he did. I mean, we're not saying...
Yeah, exactly. And it was
so who is it?
It's important to me in the movie that she wasn't seen as the bad person, is because a lot of what she was saying was true. He wasn't all white jury.
You understand? I practice in Los Angeles.
Yeah. Well, you can definitely Google it.
Okay. All right. But
Justin, we see, victims recant, their stories frequently. And that doesn't normally lead to an exoneration here in South Carolina. I mean, was that all it took there, or did you have more?
Yeah. So, and you're right, Jim, I'm very cynical about recantations because often there's motives behind them, especially we look at so many sex offender interfamilial molest cases, and you get the kid who comes forward 20 years later and says, my dad didn't molest me. And judges just look at that and go, no, that's not going to do it. We don't know what kind of pressure. Sometimes gang cases, there's pressure put on witnesses to recant their testimony. I think the thing about Brian's case that was unique, and there were many things that were unique about it, but, and this is, if you watch the movie, you'll see it portrayed, is that because Brian was out of custody, I was in the middle of a hearing on another case, and I noticed the head of the habeas unit was showing up and sitting in the back of the room watching this case. So I went up to him and I said, look, I got this client, Brian Banks, and I really believe he's innocent. Would you just sit down with him? And he said, okay. And I called Brian up, and Brian rushes down to the courthouse, and we sit down and talk for an hour, and he believed Brian. And then when the investigator tracked down the complaining witness, nobody believed her because she couldn't keep her story straight at all. With a lot of lies, it's hard to remember what you lied about. Right. So when I interviewed her, when I went to the high school, first of all, she claimed he dragged her down this hallway into the stairwell and raped her. Mm. And California high schools are so open, and this one was no exception, where there was all these classrooms, and then the teachers told us that they kept their doors open, and there was just no way he was dragging her through the school to kidnap her. And then when I questioned her, she literally just said, yeah, Brian and I went down to the stairwell, and I thought we were just going to make out. And I said, so you just went down to the stairwell with him? Yeah. And so I turned to the DA. I was like, well, there goes the kidnapping charge. Like she'd totally forgotten what she lied about. And the sad thing is, I don't consider myself some brilliant lawyer who broke her down like Perry Mason. It was just like no one asked her basic questions because the case never went to court, and it got pled out. And that's the important message in that movie and in Brian's story, is that now that we're pleading out 90% of cases, 95%, yeah. 96%, those cases, of course, most of the people are guilty. I mean, I'm not naive about it. And I always say, there's two naive positions. One is everyone's guilty and one is everyone's innocent. Most people are guilty. But what percentage of those was the person just making a business decision and cutting their losses? We don't know, but Brian was one of those people.
Well, I can't find this judge's name, but you need to text me later. I mean, I need to know one before. Anyway,
it's really hard in these cases, though, to talk to the victims because they don't have to talk to you. And you send an investigator out, and if he gets too aggressive, then you get a call from the DA saying, "Hey, you're witness tampering. You're trying to obstruct justice. Your clients. We're going to revoke your client's bond." I mean, it's tough. People don't understand how hard it is, and it is.
Well, if you watch the Brian Banks movie with Greg Kinnear playing me, you will see Greg portraying how sometimes I utilize the media to flush people out and get them to respond. And so by getting the story out into the media, actually got her to want to defend against that, even though she'd already recanted on video. And the reason, what happened was she first recanted, but then she recanted her recantation because on top of Brian going to prison, she got $1.5 million settlement from the county for allegedly being raped at school. And so then she talked to her mom, and her mom was like, what did you do? They're going to ask for that money back. And then she recanted her recantation, and then she had 16 different stories about it. So finally, when she came forward, the investigator didn't believe her, the DA didn't believe her, and they conceded. So ultimately what happened was the DA conceded his innocence.
What court was the case in, Justin? Which courthouse?
It's a Long Beach case.
Okay. Yeah. Not a great courthouse either. It's a very conservative courthouse.
Yeah, and especially with that kind of case.
Yeah. Jim, I think were we going to talk about?
Yeah, I was going to ask Justin, what inspired you to get involved with the Innocence Project, starting the Innocence Project in California? I mean, sounds like you were living a pretty good life in Michigan teaching law, right?
Yeah, I was. I mean, I started out as a criminal defense attorney in D.C. during the crack wars when D.C. was the murder capital of the world. And, after a few years, I got seduced by academia. I could move to a little town in Michigan. My kids could walk to school safely and attend a public school, and could buy a little Victorian house for $89,000. So I got lured into that life, but I was only 29 years old. And within 6 months of doing it, I read about this case, Marilyn Malero, her sitting on death row, and as a result of a plea bargain. And that just sucked me right back in. And then I decided I was just too young to be hanging up my practice, which I do love practicing law. I've been practicing my entire career. And now I've been lucky the last 25 years, I've been able to combine my practice with teaching. And I went to California to do it for a number of reasons. I mean, one of the reasons is I've got a lot of family, and San Diego is an awesome place to live. But there were 5 or 6 of us that had started innocence organizations around the country. Larry Marshall started one in Chicago. Barry Scheck started one in New York. Jackie McMurtry. There were like 5 or 6 people doing this work. Larry Hammond in Arizona. And so California was the biggest prison system in the United States, with death row and 3 strikes and, everything you need. So California was, I talked to Barry Scheck about it, and I said, I want to do this out in California. And it's incredible to see the growth of our movement, though. Our first meeting was 7 of us sharing a pizza in Chicago. And at our last meeting in Phoenix last year, we had 1,100 people who are associated with innocence organizations and exonerees. And it's really been a movement the last 20 years.
We're big fans, and we do. It's one of our, Innocence Project and ACLU are the ones that Jim and I give to most. When Jim was done with the Murdaugh trial, because there was so much hate, there still is, in Low Country, South Carolina, over this case, he made these mugs that it's really funny. It was like his picture in this, one of those cardboard things you stick your face in, as he was leaving the area, when he finished the trial. And in the back of it, it says, even my haters got haters. And we're like, okay, we got, because people were asking for the mugs. But I said to Jim, I was like, God, the mugs are like $15, $20. The shipping's another $10. Like, you can't just give away these mugs. At the same time, we're lawyers. We don't want to sell mugs. So what do we do? So we actually had them donate to the Innocence Project and send us the receipt so that they could get a mug. Anyway, so the last thing I want to sort of close with, Justin, is that, look, no system is perfect. I still think, despite the flaws in our system, we have somewhat of a decent system, depending on where in the country, of course. I lived in Brazil when I graduated law school. I practiced there for about 4.5 years. And I know that you're doing some work down there, which is why I want to talk about this. But there's a lot of very serious crimes that they're not even crimes, or they go unprosecuted. There's also a lot of corruption. Literally, it's about, what judge and what favor you can do. And there's a lot of that going on too. So tell us about what's taken you to Latin America, which countries, and what are you doing there to sort of continue this work?
Sure. Well, my first job in Latin America was in 1979 when my parents moved our family to Puerto Rico, and I worked at the first McDonald's there. And ever since then, I've been working in Latin America. So when I went through high school in Puerto Rico, and then went and learned how to speak Spanish. And when I moved to California, we're right here on the border in San Diego, it seemed a natural thing to start doing stuff in Tijuana. So I started going down, doing presentations, work with lawyers. And then I got invited to train the first 12 public defenders in Chile after the fall of Pinochet. And so I started training lawyers throughout Latin America. Just like everything in life, if you do something decently well, you keep getting invited back, and
right.
The dance card gets punched very quickly. So for the past, 25 years, I've been doing training, and then that led to, with my innocence work, naturally to starting innocence projects. And now I've been part of founding 38 projects from Chile, Argentina, all the way through South America, Brazil, Central America, and Mexico. In fact, right before this podcast, I was on the phone for the last 2 hours working with a lawyer in Mexico on a murder case. And tonight, after I'm done teaching, I'll be driving to Mexicali because tomorrow I've got a moot court competition that I'm putting on between law schools there. And so...
this might be a stupid question, but how do you train people in these countries if I mean, don't you need familiarity with their system and their law?
Yeah, you need familiarity, but mostly what I train on is trial skills.
I
So
got it.
Mexico,
Okay.
like Chile, had never had trials before, and Mexico hasn't had trials for 400 years. And in the reforms over the last 10 years, that Mexico had a constitutional amendment that created the right to trial, and oral trials. And the problem is, though, that Chile, I mean, it's a complex thing. Chile was not as challenging as Mexico, not even remotely. First of all, the size of it is nothing compared to Mexico. And we started working with lawyers in the southern tip of Chile and worked the way towards Santiago, rebuilding courthouses, training lawyers. But the big difference is that the Chileans really wanted a new government and a new system because they went through an extreme totalitarian government where there were death camps, people were being pulled out of their homes at night and executed. And whereas all the problems we have in Mexico, it was nowhere near as bad as what Chile was dealing with in the 80s and 90s. So Mexico is much tougher. Also, I didn't realize until I got a federal grant that I applied for to train Mexican law students how to do trials, because it's so challenging to train the 50-year-old lawyers. I mean, they're so resistant to change. So I said, we've got to get to the kids. Nobody realized how many law schools there were in Mexico. And take a guess how many law schools there are in Mexico. You go first, Sarah. How many do you think there would be in Mexico?
30.
Jim, what do you think?
Now that you say that, I would say 150.
Matt?
I'll take the over on Jim's. I'll say more than 200.
Well, you would win, but you're still pretty far off. There's 200 law schools in the United States. There's more than 2,000 law schools in Mexico.
Wow.
And so you have this massive system where there's no accreditation standards.
Right.
For law schools.
I was going to say there's also, because my mom used to do this accreditation work as part of, she was a professor at UCLA, but it's that I believe in Mexico, they go to law school straight from high school.
That's
right?
correct.
Yeah. So there's no degree. Yeah.
Undergraduate degree, no accreditation standards, no bar exam.
Yeah.
And so you graduate from law school in Mexico. It's as if you were a psychology major here, undergrad, and as soon as you graduated, you were a clinical psychologist or psychiatrist, where you could all of a sudden be prescribing medication. And so the problem is that they're not getting trained in law school to do this. So this new grant that I've got that I'm working at University of San Diego School of Law on, which I'm going down tonight to continue our work on, is we're trying to train the law schools how to teach trial practice, and then we create competitions between the schools to get the kids excited about learning trial skills and practicing them in competitions.
So Justin, what did Mexico have before they had trials? I mean, how would they adjudicate, a charge?
So there's a great documentary on this topic, the most watched documentary in the history of Mexico. It's called Presunto Culpable, Presumed Guilty. And you can actually just watch it by Googling it for free, because the documentarian wanted everybody to see it. And it shows you how the system worked. And the way the system worked was you would just literally file paperwork on your case. Typically, the prosecutor would meet with the judge. After they found your guy guilty, they would decide the sentence and then issue it. Everything was on paper. You could not challenge a police officer's report. Now imagine that for a second. You have the second most corrupt police force in the world, second only to Egypt. And whatever they put in that police report, you cannot challenge it. That's fact. And so everybody gets convicted, and there's no way to challenge it. And when you see in this movie, the officer doesn't even remember what they wrote on the report. It's in the same way that Brian's alleged victim doesn't remember what she lied about. And so that's what we spend a lot of time doing, is training the lawyers how to cross-examine evidence, how to cross-examine witnesses, because it's not part of their training. Wow. And it's a Roman-based system, as most of the world is. So what they do in law school is they just memorize laws. They're not learning skills. So they don't. So
they're just learning statutes and case law?
And mostly just statutes, not case law. In
Wow.
fact, case law is a weird thing for them to comprehend as to why we care so much about case law. they're always like, well, who cares what these cases say? This is what the statute is. I'm like, well, in the United States, it's all about how judges interpreted those statutes. Right. And we're so jurisdictional in such micro levels that most of the world doesn't understand how we have 57 penal codes and everything's at the county level in terms of the power. So it's very, very different in Latin America.
Are you taking any volunteers for Brazil?
That project may very well be interested. If you want me to connect you up with them, I'm happy to do it.
Yeah, for sure.
So do you speak Portuguese still?
I do. Falo português.
Oh, excellent. I do not.
Yeah.
Although it's interesting when I go there, how more people seem to speak English than speak Spanish.
Well, they get really pissed off. They get really pissed off when people start speaking Spanish in Brazil because they're like the only Latin American country or South American country that are not Spanish speakers. And people just assume that everybody there speaks Spanish. So they'd rather speak English. But I spoke Spanish before Portuguese. So when I went down there, it was, although it's not really, to me, it's not that similar to Spanish. It's more French and Italian. And I speak French. So I don't know. It came to me very easily. Not because of that, but because I have an affinity towards the country. I go there a lot and I would love to,
let me connect you up. They're great people at the Brazil Innocence Project in Sao Paulo.
Okay.
The director there actually came and worked in my office for like 6 months to learn how to do the work and then took it down there. So it's one of our most successful projects.
And of course, we're going to communicate about, I still want to know who represented Brian Banks. I'm not letting that go.
You don't let things go.
Jim, did you have any other questions for Justin as well?
No, Justin, thank you so much for coming on the Presumption podcast. It's been very enlightening. I really do appreciate you coming on, and I'm a big fan of your book and your work. And thanks for doing it.
Thank you so much, Justin, and I'll talk to you soon.
Pleasure. Take care, everybody.
Bye, you too.
All right, at this point, Sarah, I think we should.
Oh, we're going to rest, Jim.
We're resting, yes.